Okay, thank you. So thank you very much for that introduction. So I'm Kelly, I'm a postdoc from the Uni of Melbourne. Today I'm going to be talking about some new research coming out of our lab, looking at the relationship between economic inequality and morality. So some of you might remember me from talks that I've given in the past when I did my, there we go. From talks that I've probably given to the science group that usually involve my puppet. So I did developmental research here at UQ for my PhD. And you'll be happy to know that I have now gone to the dark side of social psychology, and today I'm going to try and speak your language. So I'll start here where I always start. If you've seen my presentations before, you've seen this. So here is the world's first billion-dollar home. This is a home for a family of 5 individuals in Mumbai. So it towers 27 stories high and it has a staff of 600. In the same city, we also have one of the poorest places on earth, the Dharavi slums, where you have 1 million individuals living in 2 square kilometres. If you go to other places, such as South Africa, you might see images like this, and maybe more familiar to us, the images like this that we might see in our own CBDs. So all of these show the many different diverse faces of economic inequality, broadly defined as the concentration of a majority of wealth in the hands of a minority of the population. So social identity theory and self-categorization theory have provided us with many hypotheses on the psychological effects of economic inequality. So I'm going to be walking through some hypotheses here that help inform how it might affect our psychology. So first, the fit hypothesis suggests that inequality almost by definition spreads us apart because people differ so much in terms of the material possessions that they have. So that then means that the poor becomes a more distinct category from the rich. And that then therefore makes wealth a more relevant category for us to divide people by. And this has a number of effects. For example, people see the world more in terms of wealth, they value wealth more, and they're also motivated to get wealthier. So this then leads to the wealth categorization hypothesis, which is that when we know that these categories, or when we see that these differences in society are more pronounced, we then usually see more comparisons occurring between these groups. So we compare ourselves more to what other people have. And this social comparison process also aids in enhancing a sort of us versus them dynamic. We're no longer working with everyone, but rather we're competing with everyone. And these factors have a number of effects on the sort of very social fabric of society. For example, we find there's poor relationships between, the poor and the rich groups in society. There's more negative attitudes towards newcomers, for example, immigrants. We tend to trust others less, we're less cooperative, and also tend to be more competitive. So all of this creates a sort of fractured social environment. And this then leads us to a part of the socio-structural hypothesis, which is that inequality not only creates this sense of economic instability, but also creates this sense of social and political instability. In particular, economic inequality is known to cause a state of anomie, or to perceive that society is in a state of anomie, something that you might be familiar with if you're familiar with the work of Durkheim. This is usually broken down into 2 sort of parts. So the first part is that you believe there's a breakdown in the social fabric of society. So people are looking out for themselves, you can't trust them, and there's no shared moral standards amongst people. And usually a breakdown in leadership as well. So the belief that leaders are ineffective and illegitimate. Now, these are very important aspects of a well-functioning society. And when we feel like these pillars of society are no longer functioning as they should, then we typically feel quite uncertain and insecure. And this is a very uncomfortable psychological state for us to be in. So in order to cope with this uncertainty and fear, people usually engage in behaviours that make them feel like they're taking control in this otherwise out of control world. So because of that, inequality has been linked to a number of key outcomes that are quite relevant to current times. For example, high inequality has been linked to the desire for a strong populist leader, someone who will come in and do what it takes to regain control over society. Inequality has also been linked to conspiratorial thinking as a way to try and make sense of this sort of chaotic world. So we believe in my lab that inequality is also linked to our morality, but in some pretty complicated ways. And I'm going to explain why that is soon, but first I have to try and explain what morality is, which is very difficult to explain. In particular, I'm going to be talking about this concept we call moralization. So moralization is increases in the degree to which moral relevance is attached to issues, actions, or entities. I'm going to break this down a little bit more. So we might moralize particular actions by our judgments of those actions. So what I mean here is that I might say, little Billy here has kicked Sammy in the butt. How morally wrong is this behaviour? And you might answer on the scale. So there's two parts of moralization, which we call moral recognition and moral amplification. So moral recognition is when the issue goes from being in the non-moral domain to the moral domain. So if you say not at all wrong, then it's non-moral, and if you start moving up in the scale, then it's become a moral issue. The moral amplification refers to that issue sort of becoming increasingly morally relevant as you go up that scale. So those are our judgments about actions. So we can then also have our sort of attitudes towards specific issues. So for example, I might ask you, to what extent is your position on abortion, how much is that a reflection of your core moral beliefs and convictions? And again, you can see how moral recognition and moral amplification plays out here. And finally, we can also moralize entities, in particular the rights that we give particular entities. So for example, I might ask, please indicate the level of moral concern you have for an elephant. And again, you can sort of see how this scale plays out. So in particular, we believe that economic inequality should be linked to moralization, and in two seemingly opposite directions, but I'll try and unpack why this is. So first of all, because, as I explained earlier, inequality enhances those social comparisons, those sort of us versus them dynamics, and we end up trusting others less in our environment. We have those sort of poor social connections. We believe that inequality would reduce the moralization of entities. So in particular, we would give fewer rights to more and more entities, because if we have such poor social connections in our environment, we're probably not going to care for those individuals either. Then in part two, I'm going to talk about how, when you look at moralization from a different angle, inequality might actually enhance moralization. So in particular, because we know, as I mentioned, inequality sort of enhances that sense of social instability, it creates that state of anomie, and we typically engage in those compensatory behaviours that make us feel like we're kind of regaining control. We believe that that actually might increase how much we moralise actions. So in particular, we think we might be harsher moral judges of what people do as a way to make us feel like we're regaining that control. So hopefully you can see how inequality might result in those different effects on moralization. And so I'll start with the evidence we have for part one here. So when we talk about moralizing entities, you might be familiar with the concept of moral circles. And several scholars have noted that over time, it appears that our moral circles have been expanding ever more to include more and more entities. So while it's thought that we initially cared for our kin and our sort of local tribe, over time, we started to care more about others in our own nation, others from other nations, more stigmatized individuals, and also eventually to include animals and plants. But even though it appears that on average, perhaps our moral circles have been increasing, it doesn't mean that we all have the same moral circles in current times. So there's still many differences between countries and within countries in the kinds of entities that we believe do and do not deserve moral protection. And one way to sort of capture that, sorry for people who can't see the top of the screen, is using the moral expansiveness scale that captures these individual differences in current times. That was developed by Charlie and some other people here at the Q. So in particular, with this moral expansiveness scale, individuals are shown this target here, and they're given a list of entities. For example, a co-worker, someone from another country, a murderer, an animal, etc. And they're asked to place all of these in their moral circles. So if something goes in the inner circle moral concern, it means that you believe that this individual has the highest moral standing. If it falls in the outer circle, it means you believe the individual has moderate moral standing. On the fringes of moral concern, it means you believe the individual has minimal moral standing, and if it falls outside the moral boundary, there is no moral concern that you have for this individual at all. And it deserves no moral rights, essentially. So across a variety of cultures, we asked people, how much moral concern do you have for 30 entities? And these broadly fell into 10 categories. Individuals we would consider that are close to us, those we would consider to be in-group members, those that are typically revered by society, those who are often out-group members, those who are typically stigmatized by society, those we would consider criminals, high sentient and low sentient animals, elements of the natural environment, and plants and trees. And so our participants place all of these into their sort of moral circles. And in particular, we had a pre-registered hypothesis, which is that higher inequality would relate to smaller moral circles. And this would be mediated by those sort of variables that tap into those fractured social ties. In particular, lower general trust and greater perceptions of enemy. So we looked at this across 41 locations around the world. We measured economic inequality in 3 ways. So first, we got the Gini index from the World Bank, a typical inequality indicator, which is calculated using the Lorenz curve, something I'm happy to explain at the end if anyone's interested. But the take-home point about this is that this measure of inequality takes into account the entire wealth distribution. Those in the poor, those in the middle, those who are rich. And it calculates inequality based on that. Now, we also got a subjective Gini index because more and more people are starting to realise that we don't perfectly process reality. Rather, it's our perceptions of reality that seem to affect how we behave. So we asked our participants, think of 100 citizens in your country. How many of these people do you believe would be very poor, average and wealthy, and very wealthy? And then we can do some background calculations that arrives at a sort of subjective Gini coefficient. And then finally, we asked a very explicit question on inequality, which is how large is the wealth gap between the rich and the poor? Very small or very large? On a scale, of course. And what this sort of differs from the other measures by is that this kind of conceptualizes inequality as something that occurs only between the poor and the rich, sort of ignores whatever's happening in the middle. And so we got our 2 measures of the strength of social ties. As I mentioned, we've got trust and perceptions of enemy. And our DV moral expansiveness. So if an entity was placed in the inner circle, it got a score of 3, 2 for outer, 1 for fringes, and 0 for outside the moral boundary. And this meant that we could arrive at a sort of total score of how morally expansive an individual is by summing all of those numbers together. So if you got a score of 90, that meant that you placed all of those entities in your inner circle of moral concern. So those are the largest moral circles. So looking across countries, so we found that the French part of Canada, Turkey and Poland had the largest moral circles, and places like South Korea, Slovakia and Japan have the smallest moral circles. But it's worth noting that these differences are actually pretty small. So only 4% of the variance in moral expansiveness could be explained by differences between these cultures. So I'm going to just very broadly cover what we found, but happy to go into details at the end if anyone's interested. So first of all, we were interested in whether that mediator predicted the DV, so trust and enemy, whether that predicted moral expansiveness. We found that those who trusted others more tended to have larger moral circles, whereas we found no relationship for perceptions of enemy. But when we broke it down into the 2 subscales, we found that when you believed there was a lot of enemy in the social fabric of society, you had smaller moral circles, and there was no relationship to enemy within leadership. So what this kind of suggests to us is that it's really about those sort of the quality of those social ties in your environment that matters for moral expansiveness. Now, finally, we wanted to look at inequality and how much that predicted trust, enemy within the social fabric, and moral expansiveness. And very broadly speaking, we didn't really find that country-level Gini predicted anything. We didn't find that subjective Gini predicted anything, but we did find that the wealth gap question did. So when you believe that that gap between the rich and the poor is large, you tend to trust others less. You believe there's more anomie in the social fabric, and you have smaller moral circles. So I'm happy to go into the end why I think that measure might have come out, whereas the others didn't. But for sake of time, I'll just quickly move on. So for our mediation analysis, so we then ran those through, and what we found was that a belief that the wealth gap was large related to smaller moral circles, and this was mediated by lower general trust. But this is not mediated by greater perceptions of anomie in social fabric. That significance value was about 0.06 or something. So what this kind of suggests is that it might really be that element of general trust that matters for this relationship here. And it kind of makes sense because trust really is the glue that binds relationships. And if you don't feel like you can trust others, if you feel like they're just looking out for themselves, then you're probably not going to care for them either. So for sake of time, I'm going to move on and talk about part 2 because this is my favorite part and this is also the new part. So this is when I'm going to talk about how inequality might instead result in increased moralization when we think about moralization from a different perspective. So in particular, we believe that inequality creates this sort of sense of social instability, as I sort of explained earlier. And we also believe that this actually creates quite a threatening environment. And that's because we're such an inherently social and cooperative species. And when those social relationships are so fractured, that we might feel like we're under a state of threat. And there's a lot of theories that sort of propose what happens when we're in these environments that create this sort of sense of threat. So tight loose culture theory suggests that we aim to tighten the norms of society when we're faced with a sort of environmental threat. In particular, we gravitate towards wanting clear social rules, and we also want to punish those who deviate from those social rules. Likewise, compensatory control theory suggests that we engage in compensatory behaviours when we feel as though we've lost control. And we believe that these kind of threatening environments will result in that sense that you've lost control. So all of this pointed towards a similar conclusion for us, which is that we believe having a stringent moral code might actually be one way for us to tighten the norms of society and feel like we're regaining that control. And we think that might be a particularly effective way for us to feel like we're regaining control because it not only provides guidance on how you should behave, if you've got clear-cut moral standards for things, you know exactly what you have to do when you go out in the world. So that gives you a sense of internal control, but it also gives you a sense of external control because we often project our morals on others and what we think others should do. And so it might aid in sort of bringing us together as a collective to sort of deal with whatever threat we're facing. So before I move on, I also briefly want to touch on the good and the bad of moralization. And that's because I think often when we think about morals, we often have this sort of a positive connotation that comes alongside the word, but I think it's worth talking about maybe the flip side of that as well. So in particular, when things become moralized, we see an increase in collective action and political participation. So people are really motivated to go out there in the world and do something about the issue. And this can be an awesome thing when you think about the things that you care about, such as climate change. Getting out there and marching on the streets is a great way for us to get towards some sort of action. But you can also see it as potentially a bad thing when you think about the things you don't agree with. So for example, the vaccine marches became a moral issue for people. And we also have, the far right movement. For many people, going out there in the streets and doing something about that is because it's fueled by this sort of moral anger. And likewise, if you go back in history, the Nazi movement was also very much so a moral movement. You're also more likely to place yourself in an echo chamber by distancing yourself from people who believe different things to you and gravitating towards those who think the same things as you. You're also less likely to update your beliefs in light of new evidence and more likely to think that your beliefs on that matter are objective and universal rules that everyone should adopt. And finally, you're also more likely to think you should achieve the moral end goal through any means necessary, including the use of violence. So you can sort of see how all of these things might actually be or play a part in political polarization. So when these political issues become more moral issues for us, you can see how that might divide us from those who think differently to us. So back to the evidence now and looking at the relationship between inequality and our moral judgments. So there's a lot of ways to think about the many issues that we might judge. And one way to sort of categorize all these different things we might care about is using moral foundations theory. So in particular, we asked our participants, how wrong do you think all of these scenarios are? And they fell into 6 broad categories. For example, if something fell into the harm foundation, it means that you believe that it was, or if you said that this was really wrong, it means that you believe that it's wrong to sort of harm someone. The fairness foundation instead describes scenarios where you might think it's wrong if someone cheats to get ahead or doesn't get what they deserve. The liberty foundation describes scenarios where someone's freedoms might be oppressed. The authority scenario describes situations where someone doesn't respect authority. Purity describes situations where an individual might do something that could be deemed as impure or degrading. And the loyalty scenario describes situations where you might not be loyal to your in-group. And so there's many different ways of sort of looking at these different foundations. So you can look at them individually. You can also group the top 3 together, which they typically call the individualizing foundations. And these are more typically adopted by political liberals. And the bottom 3 are typically called defining foundations, which are more often adopted by conservatives. But we were also interested not really in any specific moral domain, but rather the tendency to moralize overall. So we also created a measure that kind of averaged the tendency to harshly judge all of these scenarios. So we again looked at this across cultures, and we found that places like Malaysia, Portugal, and Peru tended to be the harshest moral judges. And places like South Korea, Poland, and Thailand tended to be the least harsh moral judges. And this difference was much larger than moral expansiveness. So about 13% of the variance in moralization can be explained by differences between cultures. So basically what we found is we sort of measured inequality in the same 3 ways that I discussed in the previous study. Then no matter which way we looked at it, higher inequality was related to harsher moral judgments. So this was for that total moralization score, also for individualizing and binding, and also came out for a majority of those specific foundations as well. So for example, here's a graph that shows the relationship between moralization on the y-axis and that subjective Gini coefficient on the x-axis. So what this kind of suggests to us is that this relationship is not necessarily about moral judgments more specific to inequality, such as those fairness judgments. And it also can't be explained necessarily by one side of the political spectrum. So for example, us becoming more conservative. So we were then interested in looking at this in a real world domain, so on Twitter, because a lot of our moral discourse in current times occurs on Twitter. So we got tweets from 2012 to 2020 across the US, which was a random 1% of the Twitter stream, resulting in 1 billion tweets. And we ran the Moral Foundations Dictionary through this. And that resulted in about 28 million tweets that contained at least one of these words. So we could look at the tendency to just include any moral word in the tweet, so looking at moralization across the board. We could look at each foundation specifically. We could group it into individualizing and binding, and also group it into this new category, vice and virtue, which looks at the tendency to use more positive words for virtue, like help, and more negative words for vice, like harm. And so what we found was that higher inequality on the place level in the US was linked to more moral content in tweets. And this effect came out no matter which way we looked at it. So all those different ways of chopping and changing it, the same conclusion came out. And I should also mention that we also controlled for other variables that you might think would influence this, that I'm happy to talk about at the end. We also cross-lagged our models and showed that inequality at time 1 was clearly linked to moral content in tweets at time 2, giving us a little bit more of an indicator of causality. It's also worth noting this is a very crude way to look at things. We obviously can't know what is occurring in 28 million tweets, so we can't know for sure if this is a case of people engaging in moral judgment, talking about issues, talking about entities. So this is more about, I suppose, more moral talk happening across the board. So in study 3, we then wanted to get some experimental evidence, in particular for our proposed mediator or our proposed mechanism of this effect. So we got participants on Prolific and we manipulated inequality to see if this affected a desire for tighter norms in society. In particular, we used the Bimbula paradigm, which emerges participants in a fictitious world. So participants are told they're part of this world and they're also shown the different wealth categories of this world. In the high inequality condition, you can see that those differences are quite stark between the wealth categories. And in the low inequality condition, they're quite equal in comparison. And participants are always assigned to wealth category 2, which you can see is matched across those two scenarios. And to make things a little bit more salient, participants also asked to choose a house, a car, and a holiday. And they can also see what the other wealth groups can choose. So for example, the choices in high inequality looks like this. You can see there's obviously a lot of inequality happening here. And in low inequality, it looks like this. Similar differences you can see with the choice of car and differences in the choice of holiday. I think Yolanda made this, so you can blame her. So then what we essentially found was that exposure to high inequality caused a greater desire to tighten the norms in society. So in particular, you might be interested in the kinds of questions we asked. So for example, there needs to be more social norms that people are supposed to abide by in Bimbula. And in Bimbula, if someone acts in an inappropriate way, people should strongly disapprove. So those kinds of questions. So that's where we're at the moment. And we've got a lot of unanswered questions coming from this data. So in particular, one thing we really want to know is we might be harsh on moral judges, perhaps, but then does this actually result in us engaging in a particular action? So do we end up punishing others more under situations of high inequality? So we're interested in punishment in the softer sense, how we sort of punish people for non-criminal moral violations, but also in the harder sense for criminal violations. And so those are the different directions that we're going in at the moment. We also know from a lot of literature now that high inequality is clearly linked to greater political polarisation. And we believe that our work may provide a psychological explanation for why that might be. People are moralising more, then you can see how groups might form and distance themselves from society. We're also interested in whether inequality might increase moralisation for particular issues, abortion, climate change, vaccines, all of those more specific things that you don't really get in those moral judgment questions. And more broadly, we're interested in really understanding whether moralisation might actually be this broad response that we give in response to threat. So beyond just economic inequality, are there other sources of environmental threat, like climatic threat, resource scarcity, pathogen prevalence, those sorts of things that might actually result in greater moralisation. So I would like to thank my many colleagues that contributed to one or both of these projects, as well as the many people across the world who helped collect this very rich data set. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you.